Look, if you take the numbers for this financial year and then the numbers for the financial year 27-28, that's £13.4 billion increase.
Speaker, that wasn't very clear. How is it that the Defence Secretary says 6 billion and he says 13.4 billion?
That is the largest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, which will put us in a position to ensure the security and defence of our country and of Europe.
A third of UK employers have already reduced planned salary increases for 2025 due to the looming tax changes pushed by Starmer's government. While the Labour leader theatrically demanded answers about defence spending at PMQs today, he conveniently avoided discussing how his policies are directly impacting British workers' wages. This calculated distraction technique was on full display as Starmer manufactured outrage over a supposed discrepancy between the PM's announced £13.4 billion defence spending increase and the Defence Secretary's £6 billion figure. Behind this smokescreen lies the uncomfortable reality. Average wage increases have dropped to just 3%, while 41% of companies are increasing scrutiny around hiring and 28% are considering staff cuts. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. The latest Prime Minister's questions revealed a masterclass in political theatre, but not the kind Sir Keir Starmer likely intended. What we witnessed was a calculated attempt to manufacture confusion where none existed, all centered around defense spending figures that had already been clearly explained weeks prior. Starmer's performance betrayed a troubling pattern.
Over the weekend, I suggested to the Prime Minister that he cut the aid budget, and I'm pleased that he accepted my advice. He announced £13.4 billion in additional defence spending yesterday. This morning, his Defence Secretary said the uplift is only £6 billion, which is the correct figure. Mr. Speaker, it's the fastest response. It's the fastest response I've ever had from the Prime Minister.
While constantly preaching about the need for clarity and transparency from others, his own questioning tactics deliberately muddied the waters on defense spending. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. He repeatedly pretended not to understand the difference between current defense spending and projected increases through 2027-28, despite the Prime Minister having already provided a crystal-clear explanation. What makes this theatre particularly concerning is how Starmer attempted to create the impression of contradiction between the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary. His question, how is it that the Defence Secretary says $6 billion and he says $13.4 billion? Wasn't an innocent request for clarification. It was a calculated move to suggest governmental confusion while actually generating it himself.
If you take the financial year this year, and then you take the financial year for 2027-28, the difference between the two is £13.4 billion.
The IFS said today that the government is playing silly games with numbers. How does he find this difference in numbers?
That's the same answer. If you ask again, I'll give the same answer again.
The Prime Minister's growing exasperation throughout the exchange spoke volumes. Having already addressed identical questions just 2 weeks earlier, he was forced to watch Starmer recycle the same manufactured controversy. The PM's response cut straight to the heart of Starmer's tactics. If you ask again, I'll give the same answer again. This simple statement exposed the opposition's strategy of repetition without substance. Most revealing was how Starmer's accusations that the government was playing silly games with numbers served as a perfect mirror reflecting his own approach to political discourse. This projection tactic, accusing others of exactly what you're doing yourself, has become increasingly transparent in Labour's parliamentary strategy. Meanwhile, as Starmer fixated on these trivial numerical discrepancies, a much more significant economic story was unfolding across Britain. His government's national insurance tax changes are having real-world consequences that deserve scrutiny. A third of UK employers, that's 33%, are now reducing planned salary increases for 2025 directly because of these tax policies, with contribution rates set to jump by 1.2 percentage points to a staggering 15%. Businesses are facing enormous pressure that will inevitably lead to hiring freezes and potential job cuts. Yet Starmer conveniently avoids discussing these substantive economic impacts. It's far easier to create theatrical confusion over defense numbers than to defend policies that are actively harming British workers' wage prospects. This deliberate misdirection serves a clear purpose: to distract from the painful economic realities his government has created. Perhaps most telling was Starmer's reaction when his strategy failed. Rather than engaging with the substance of the Prime Minister's consistent explanations, he resorted to accusations of patronizing behavior. It was the political equivalent of flipping the chessboard when you're losing, a desperate move that revealed his frustration at being unable to create the artificial outrage he sought.
Mr. Speaker, someone needs to tell the Prime Minister that being patronising is not a substitute. It's not a substitute for answering questions. It's not a substitute. He hasn't answered.
Security guarantees in Ukraine, and that is extremely important, because the worst of all outcomes, if there's to be a cessation of hostilities, is that it is a short break rather than sustained and lasting peace.
Mr. Speaker, this is an endeavour that we want to support him in, but we need to know exactly what it is we're supporting. We need clarity and transparency over the money. We also need to know where this money is going.
This exchange highlighted a fundamental weakness in Starmer's approach. When confronted with straightforward, consistent answers that don't provide openings for manufactured controversy, he struggles to adapt. His repetitive questioning strategy works only when opponents take the bait and deviate from previous explanations, giving him an opening to cry inconsistency. By maintaining consistency and refusing to engage with Starmer's manufactured controversy, the Prime Minister effectively neutralized the attack. The opposition leader was left recycling questions that had already been answered, creating an impression not of governmental confusion but of his own tactical limitations. Behind the theatre of PMQs lies the harsh reality that British workers are now facing. The newest research reveals a staggering 28% of businesses are planning employee headcount reductions, with an additional 41% implementing hiring freezes across their organisations. Direct consequences of Labour's increased tax burden. While Starmer distracts with manufactured defence spending controversies, these alarming employment figures represent real families facing uncertain futures. His government's economic policies are quietly dismantling job security across the UK. Yet he chooses to focus on creating political drama rather than addressing the employment crisis he's creating. The pattern is unmistakable. When faced with substantive economic concerns, Starmer deflects with accusations and theatrics. As British businesses make difficult decisions about their workforce, voters must ask themselves, who is truly avoiding the important debates? The real question isn't about defence spending figures. It's about whether working Britons can afford Starmer's policies at all.